Close your eyes and take a deep breath. Today I invite you into a legend that has traveled across centuries, a story of love, fate, and divine jealousy born in the ancient world of the Greek gods. In a distant kingdom lived a princess named Psyche, whose beauty was said to rival even the goddesses of Olympus. People crossed seas and deserts just to glimpse her face, and soon admiration turned into something far more dangerous: worship. High above the mortal world, Aphrodite, the goddess of love and beauty, watched this rising devotion with growing anger, and in a moment of wounded pride she set a cruel plan into motion. What followed was not merely a tale of beauty, but a mysterious journey shaped by hidden gods, a forbidden love with Eros, the very god who commands the hearts of the world, and a fragile promise that must never be broken. Yet a single moment of curiosity would shatter that promise and send Psyche on a long and uncertain path through loneliness, impossible trials, and even the shadowed gates of the underworld, all in the hope of winning back the love she had lost. Disclaimer: the visuals used in this video were created using artificial intelligence. There are no bloody or disturbing scenes. However, some moments have been designed to enhance the cinematic and emotional depth of the story. If you are sensitive to such imagery, please consider this before watching. Additionally, the narration in this video includes mythological themes such as betrayal, tragedy, and fate. This content is presented purely within a mythological and literary context. If you wish to join me on these mythic journeys, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, turn on the notification bell, and leave a comment below telling me which story you'd like to explore next. I look forward to sailing through these timeless tales together, one legend at a time. Take a deep breath, relax your mind, and let the rhythm of the waves guide you. Wishing you a peaceful sleep. The epic of Eros and Psyche, the soul's journey of love, begins now. Long ago, in a city whose name was whispered only on broken tablets and in the faded corners of forgotten maps, there stood a kingdom that lived in peace and prosperity. In those ancient lands ruled a wise king and a graceful queen, and the three princesses who grew up within the marble courtyards of the palace were considered the pride of the people. Each of these daughters was known for her beauty, yet the youngest, Psyche, had set herself apart from the others in an inexplicable way from the very moment of her birth. Her sisters were elegant, charming, and striking, yet their beauty still remained within human measure. It could be described with words and compared with other faces. Psyche's face, however, held a strange harmony that the human mind struggled to explain. Those who saw her sometimes held their breath and sometimes turned their eyes away, because her beauty felt less like something to praise and more like the quiet presence of something almost sacred. When she walked through the shadowed corridors of the palace, even the sound of her footsteps faded before it could echo. When she appeared in the stone streets of the city, conversations fell silent. Time itself seemed to slow for a moment, as if it wished to watch the young princess's steps. As time passed, the stories told about Psyche's beauty spread beyond the borders of the kingdom and reached distant lands. Merchants who crossed the seas, soldiers returning from their journeys, and curious travelers told the tale of the young princess wherever they went. Before long, crowds began to pour into the city, hoping to see Psyche with their own eyes. Foreigners stepped down from the ships that docked at the harbor, not only to trade, but also for the chance to catch a single glimpse of that legendary beauty. When Psyche passed through the city square, people stepped aside with reverence. Some knelt, while others performed an ancient gesture of worship, placing the index finger of their right hand over the thumb and bringing it to their lips. Once, this gesture had been reserved only for the gods, yet now people offered the same reverence to Psyche. Those who saw her began to believe that such flawless beauty could belong only to the goddesses who lived upon Olympus. And so, almost without realizing it, a new thought took shape upon the tongues of the people. Psyche might be a second Aphrodite who had descended to the earth. Before long, this thought grew from a simple rumor into a powerful belief. People no longer visited the temples of Aphrodite, the true goddess of love and beauty, as often as they once had. The harbor of Paphos, once filled with ships, had grown quiet. The grand temple in Knidos stood with its steps nearly empty. On the island of Cythera, the sacred altars no longer sent sacrifice smoke into the sky. The wreaths offered to the goddess withered, and a thin layer of dust settled upon her marble statues. Yet on those same days, the roads Psyche walked became covered with flowers, and the people organized small celebrations in her honor. They brought offerings to her and laid their prayers not toward the heavens but at her feet. Without anyone fully noticing, divine honor had been taken from the sky and given to a mortal woman upon the earth. This was not merely a misunderstanding, it was the quiet disturbance of the divine order itself. And for Aphrodite, who lived in the heights of the heavens, no insult could have been greater. From the shining peaks of Olympus, Aphrodite watched what unfolded upon the earth, and as she watched, she began to tremble with anger. She was Venus, born from the foam of the sea, the absolute queen of love, desire, and beauty. The prayers rising from her temples and the desires beating in human hearts across the world had always fed her power. But now those prayers had fallen silent, and the people had begun to glorify a mortal in her place. The goddess threw her head back in fury and began to speak to herself. She reminded herself that she was the ancient mother of the universe, the creator of the elements, and Venus, the one who placed love within the hearts of all living things. For a mortal to step into the shadow of such power was unbearable. "My place in the heavens," she whispered in anger, "has been stained by a mortal girl who walks the earth bearing my likeness." As her anger grew, it hardened into a dark decision. Psyche's beauty was no longer seen as a gift. It had become an act of arrogance that demanded punishment. To carry out this revenge, Aphrodite immediately summoned her son Eros. The winged young god was one of the strangest and most dangerous beings upon Olympus. With the bow in his hand and the golden-tipped arrows in his quiver, he ruled over the hearts of both gods and mortals. The arrows he released could set even the coldest heart ablaze with wild love, and could leave even the strongest mind helpless in an instant. Eros's mischievous nature was often discussed on Olympus. At night, he slipped silently into the homes of mortals, and by the pale light of his torch, drove his arrows into the hearts of the sleeping, casting them into passions that lasted until morning. For that reason, even the gods feared his tricks, and mortals often blamed their sudden bursts of love on this unseen god. When Aphrodite called her son to her side, her voice carried both the tone of a mother and the harshness of vengeance. She pointed to Psyche from afar and gave a single command. This girl would fall madly in love with the lowest and most hideous creature in the world. She would bind herself to a being abandoned by fortune, a creature with a dreadful face and a life buried in misery, and in that way, her beauty would become the cruelest mockery of her own fate. After hearing his mother's words, Eros lowered his head in silence. Then he opened his wings, wrapped himself in his cloak of invisibility, and glided down toward the earth. Night had already fallen over the palace, and the moonlight that slipped through the windows left a pale silver glow upon the marble walls. When the god reached the young princess's chamber, he found Psyche held in the arms of deep sleep. Even in the darkness, the sleeping girl's face seemed to give off a faint light, as if her beauty brightened the air within the room itself. Eros prepared the golden arrows in his hand, but at that very moment something unexpected happened. The calm and innocent expression upon Psyche's face stirred a strange feeling within the god of love's heart, something he had never felt before. For a moment he hesitated. The mortal girl lying before him did not look like the arrogant rival his mother had described. She seemed instead like a soul left defenseless in the middle of fate itself. Outside the palace, the people were still holding celebrations in Psyche's honor, greeting her as though she were a goddess. But in the heavens above, jealousy had already begun to grow, and that jealousy had already begun to change the fate of the young princess. And that night, in a moment no one noticed, the games of the gods once again bound the destinies of gods and mortals together. When Eros stood beside Psyche's bed to carry out the command his mother had given him, the palace lay wrapped in the deep silence of night. He slowly drew back his bow, took one of his sharpest arrows from the quiver, and aimed it toward his target. This arrow had pierced countless hearts, and had even changed the fate of gods. Yet in that moment, an unusual hesitation lingered in Eros's hand. Psyche slept peacefully, her breathing soft and steady, and the expression on her face carried the innocent calm of a child. Moonlight slipped through the thin curtains of the window and fell upon the young girl's face, surrounding her beauty with an almost otherworldly glow. Eros stepped a little closer to his victim. He wanted to see the face of this mortal more clearly, to understand the strange enchantment that surrounded her. But at that very moment, the small and irreversible mistake that would change the course of fate occurred. The sharp tip of the arrow in his hand brushed against his own skin and lightly scratched the god's flesh without his noticing. The tiny wound did not draw even a drop of blood, yet nothing more was needed for Eros to fall under the spell of his own magic. The arrows of the god of love had been made to strike others, not himself. At that moment, a slow but irresistible fire began to rise within Eros. This fire was neither physical pain nor an ordinary desire. It was the famous and unavoidable passion created by his arrows. Even though he was a god, he could not resist his own magic. His heart began to draw towards Psyche in a way he had never felt before. The young god suddenly remembered the command his mother had given him. Psyche was supposed to fall in love with the most vile and terrifying creature in the world. But that command had already shattered inside him. Eros had fallen madly in love with the very mortal girl his mother wanted to punish. This was not only love, it was also a great betrayal against Aphrodite. For a while, Eros remained beside Psyche, watching her face and feeling the weight of this new emotion growing within him. Then he quietly stepped back. Opening his wings, he slipped away through the dark corridors of the palace like an invisible shadow. That night, as he disappeared into the sky, Eros was no longer only the god of love. He had become a lover imprisoned by his own secret. Completely unaware of this divine drama, Psyche was drifting toward the strangest and loneliest period of her life. Stories about her beauty continued to spread from city to city, and people still traveled from distant lands just to see her. In public squares, her name was spoken everywhere. Some greeted her as if she were a goddess, while others believed that even touching her would bring misfortune. Yet all this admiration brought Psyche no happiness. Her sisters had already married powerful princes, moved to their own palaces, and built lives of their own. Psyche, however, faced flowers, prayers, and admiring gazes every morning when she stepped outside her home, and behind all of it, she felt a deep emptiness. Men knelt before her, offered gifts, and praised her beauty, yet none of them dared approach her as a woman. No one thought of holding her hand, sharing a life with her, or offering her true love. In this way, Psyche slowly became something people admired, but no one could truly touch. As time passed, the young princess began to feel less like a living person and more like a sacred statue carved from marble. People watched her, praised her, and even blessed her, yet no one saw the loneliness within her. While walking through the palace gardens, she sometimes thought about her sisters, their laughter, the warm lives they shared with their husbands, and the voices of children echoing through their halls. These thoughts filled Psyche's heart with a deep sadness. She possessed a beauty admired by the entire world, yet she seemed to have lost the right to be loved as a human being. The overwhelming respect people showed her had turned into an invisible wall that separated her from real life. No one could fall in love with a goddess. They could only worship her. Psyche had begun to face this truth. The flowers people brought her no longer gave her joy. Instead, they awakened a deep loneliness in her heart. She did not want to be a goddess. She only wanted to be a person who could be loved. Psyche's father, the king, began to feel deep concern as he watched all of this unfold. At first, the respect the people showed Psyche had seemed like a source of pride, but over time the old ruler began to sense that something ominous hid behind it. The paleness in his daughter's face, the tired look in her eyes, and her slow withdrawal from the crowds of the palace filled him with worry. Many nights the king remained awake for hours, standing on the palace balcony and watching the lights of the city while whispering silent prayers to the gods. To him, this situation did not feel like ordinary fate. Perhaps some hidden plan or anger of the gods had begun to overshadow his daughter's life. In the end, that thought pushed the king toward a decision. He had to consult an oracle in order to learn the will of the gods. Perhaps the destiny written in the heavens could only be understood that way. Yet the king did not know how terrible a path that decision would soon lead Psyche onto. Meanwhile, in the heavens, Aphrodite still enjoyed the taste of her supposed victory. The goddess believed her son had obeyed her command and that Psyche's fate had already been driven into darkness. The truth, however, was very different. Under the influence of the powerful passion created by his own arrow, Eros returned to the palace every night on invisible wings. He quietly entered Psyche's chamber, watched the sleeping girl, and felt the growing weight of the forbidden love within his heart. He did not even dare to touch her, because this love threatened not only his mother's wrath, but also the order of the gods themselves. In this way, Eros became trapped between two worlds. On one side, his loyalty to his mother, and on the other, the mortal girl who had captured his heart. Psyche's loneliness was actually the beginning of a destiny she did not yet understand. That loneliness marked the first step of the long and painful journey a soul had to travel before it could reach true love. The silence that drifted through the palace's tall marble halls was not the calm of an ordinary evening. It felt more like a dark shadow that warned of an unseen fate slowly approaching. Once, laughter had echoed through the palace courtyards. Lavish feasts had filled the gold-decorated halls, and guests from every corner of the kingdom had spoken with admiration about the beauty of the royal daughters. Now those same walls carried a different feeling, unease. The king and queen stood by the high palace windows, staring into the deepening darkness, while troubling thoughts gnawed at their hearts. The beauty of their youngest daughter, Psyche, had enchanted the entire world. Yet as time passed, that enchantment began to resemble the sign of something strange and unsettling. Psyche's fame had crossed the borders of the kingdom and reached distant islands and unknown lands. Merchants who sailed the seas, travelers from distant roads, and curious crowds flooded into the city for one reason alone: to see the legendary beauty with their own eyes. Those who saw her often forgot how to speak. Some bowed their heads in reverence, while others touched their lips in the ancient gesture once used to greet the gods, honoring her almost as if she were a sacred being. As time passed, Psyche was no longer seen by the people as merely a princess. They began to see her as the living image of a goddess who had descended to the earth. At first, that admiration seemed like a blessing, yet it slowly turned into a strange curse that isolated the young girl even more. No one dared to marry her. Her sisters had already wed powerful princes and departed for distant kingdoms, beginning new lives within their own palaces. Their days were filled with feasts, celebrations, and the laughter of children. Psyche, however, remained inside the palace as a figure everyone admired, but no one dared approach. Men knelt before her, praised her beauty, and offered precious gifts, yet none of them dared ask for her hand. No one could fall in love with a goddess. A goddess could only be worshipped. That strange admiration became the beginning of the fear growing in the king's heart. Night after night he sat alone on the palace balcony, watching the slow mists rising over the distant hills, while the same thought troubled his mind. The gods might not look kindly upon people worshipping a mortal so openly. Perhaps Psyche's fate had already become part of some hidden design of the gods. Perhaps her beauty was not a gift, but a sign of approaching disaster. At last the king could no longer endure the uncertainty. He decided to seek the sacred oracle of the god Apollo and learn his daughter's fate. After a long and exhausting journey, he traveled to the holy temple at Miletus. Apollo's sanctuary was one of the most respected centers of prophecy in the ancient world. Marble columns rose toward the sky, and incense burned near the entrance, filling the air with a heavy fragrance. People came from every corner of the world to learn the secrets of their destiny. When the king slowly climbed the stone steps of the temple, his heart beat with both hope and dread. Offerings were made to the god, sacred fires were lit, and the ritual of prophecy began. A heavy silence filled the temple, and everyone held their breath. The oracle entered a deep trance, and the voice of Apollo echoed through her lips. Yet the words the king hoped to hear never came. The prophecy was terrifying. Psyche would never marry a mortal man. Her fate was to unite with a winged and serpent-like creature feared even by the gods. The being was described as a wild force that roamed the skies, breathed fire, and filled all who saw it with terror. But the prophecy did not end there. Apollo's command was clear and absolute. Psyche must be adorned like a bride, yet she would not be given to a wedding but to her destiny. The king must take his daughter to the top of a high cliff and leave her there to await the arrival of that dreadful being. When these words returned to the palace, the entire kingdom fell into mourning. Preparations that were once expected to lead to a wedding now resembled a funeral procession. Bridal torches were lit, yet their light did not celebrate joy. Instead, they illuminated the sorrow of an approaching farewell. People whispered through the streets, and many struggled to hide their tears. When the day of the procession arrived, a heavy silence filled the city. Psyche walked forward dressed as a bride, yet it was not a bridal procession. It was the march of a sacrifice moving toward her fate. At last, the procession reached the towering cliffs beyond the city. The sun had already slipped behind the horizon, and the sky had darkened with the heavy shadow of twilight. The wind roared along the edge of the cliff, and the valley below stretched out like a dark void. After embracing their daughter one final time, the king and queen were forced to turn back, for no one could defy the command of the gods. Soon Psyche remained alone upon the cliff. The wind lifted her hair and stirred her bridal gown, while the deep roar rising from the abyss filled the night. The young princess waited for the monster feared even by the gods, standing alone with the darkness of her fate. Yet there was something she did not know. What destiny had prepared for her was far different from what the prophecy had described. For at that very moment, an unseen presence had already begun to move across the night sky. Zephyros, the gentle god of the west wind, had spread his wings and begun to blow across the cliff as part of the god's hidden design. The journey that would change Psyche's life forever was about to begin. Left alone at the edge of the cliff, Psyche stood motionless for a long time. The sound of the procession that had accompanied her had long since faded, and the anguished cries of her mother and father had vanished into the howl of the wind. The crowd that had brought her there only moments earlier seemed to have dissolved like a dream, leaving behind nothing but the hard stone beneath her feet and the slow descent of night. A cold wind rose from the depths of the cliff and tugged at her thin bridal gown. The sky had not yet turned completely dark. A heavy twilight, where shades of purple and black blended together, spread across the world like a curtain. When the young girl closed her eyes, she felt how violently her heart pounded inside her chest. Apollo's terrible prophecy echoed again and again in her mind. A winged, serpent-like creature, feared even by the gods, would take her and carry her into an unknown fate. The more Psyche tried to imagine what kind of creature awaited her, the more dreadful shapes filled her thoughts. Giant wings, twisting serpent bodies, mouths that breathed fire, and screams powerful enough to shake the heavens. All the terrifying legends people whispered in fear tangled together in her mind, while the wind howled among the rocks and she continued to wait. Yet as time passed, the attack she expected never came. No sound of massive wings echoed through the sky, and no terrible rustling of some monstrous body slithering across the rocks reached her ears. The silence of the night grew heavier than the fear created by expectation itself. Psyche slowly opened her eyes. At that moment she felt a strange breeze brush across her face. This wind did not resemble the sharp and ruthless winds of the cliff. It felt softer, warmer, almost gentle. Carrying the scent of spring flowers, the breeze touched her as if nature itself had reached out to comfort the young princess. Within that touch, Psyche felt a strange calm, This was not an ordinary wind. It was Zephyros, the god of the west wind. In the stories of the ancient world, Zephyros was known as the gentlest of the wind gods and the herald of spring. He carried none of the harsh force of the northern winds or the burning dryness of the eastern winds. Zephyros was known as the wind that awakened the earth, opened flowers, and calmed the seas. The gods sometimes sent the winds to change the course of fate, and that night Zephyros came to Psyche as part of their hidden design. The wind suddenly grew stronger, yet its strength was not destructive. Instead, it surrounded Psyche carefully, holding her without harming her. When the young princess realized her feet had lifted from the ground, her heart nearly stopped. For a moment she believed she had begun to fall from the cliff. Yet in the next instant, she understood that her body was not plunging downward. An unseen force carried her. Zephyros gently lifted Psyche into the air, and the young girl rose lightly like a feather. The wind did not drop her into the abyss. Instead, it carried her through the air. Psyche shut her eyes in fear, but the wind's touch was nothing like the savage force she had imagined. It felt soft and reassuring, like a mother rocking her child. Zephyros carried the young princess away from the cliff and drifted across the dark valley below. When Psyche opened her eyes again, she saw the world beneath her slowly changing. The jagged rocks and shadowy cliffs faded behind her, replaced by green hills and valleys covered in flowers. As the night deepened, the moon rose higher in the sky and spread its silver light across the earth. At last, Zephyros slowly lowered Psyche toward the ground. When the young princess was placed upon the soft grass, she still struggled to understand what had happened. For a while she remained where she was, unable to move. The fear and shock she had experienced had drained all her strength. The gentle breeze carried by Zephyros continued to drift around her, spreading the scent of flowers through the air. When Psyche finally opened her eyes, the sight before her stole her breath. Instead of the deadly cliff where she had waited for her fate, the place where she now stood resembled a paradise upon the earth. The valley stretched wide and green. Soft grass shimmered beneath the moonlight, and flowers of every color swayed gently in the breeze. A clear spring flowed through the center of the valley, and the sound of the water echoed through the quiet night like a peaceful melody. Yet what truly captured Psyche's attention was the magnificent structure rising at the heart of the valley. It was a palace, but it was no ordinary palace. The building did not look as if it had been made by human hands. Golden columns caught the moonlight and reflected it outward, while silver walls shimmered even in the darkness of night. The doors had been carved from ivory, and the wide stairways of the palace had been decorated with precious stones. The mosaics on the floor glittered with patterns that resembled the star-filled sky. For a moment, Psyche stood completely still, staring at the scene before her. Once, her father's palace had seemed like the most magnificent place in the world, but now she understood that this structure surpassed the palaces of kings. This was the kind of palace that could belong only to a god. Psyche began to walk slowly toward it. When she reached the entrance, she hesitated. No one appeared inside. There were no guards and no servants. Yet the moment she stepped through the doorway, a gentle voice spoke around her. "Welcome, my lady." Psyche flinched and looked around in surprise. No one stood there. The voice spoke again. "This palace is your home. Everything here exists to serve you." Psyche stood in astonishment. The voice sounded kind and reassuring, Yet hearing someone speak without seeing them still felt strange. Soon other voices echoed through the halls. Invisible servants greeted Psyche while the palace doors opened by themselves. When the young princess stepped deeper inside, she saw that the wide halls were filled with ornaments of gold and silver. Lamps hanging from the ceilings cast a soft light, and the carvings along the walls told scenes from ancient myths. Before long, a great table appeared before Psyche, and in an instant it filled with food. Honey, fruits, fresh bread, and cups of wine were served by unseen hands. At that moment, a gentle music began to rise through the palace halls. A lyre was playing, though no musician could be seen. The melody drifted through the air and echoed softly against the stone walls. For the first time, Psyche truly felt that she was not alone. Yet one question still lingered in her mind. Who was the master of this palace? Was it the terrible monster Apollo had spoken of? As the night deepened, the moon continued to illuminate the palace's silver walls. Invisible servants guided Psyche into a chamber covered in silk. The bed was soft, and the room carried the scent of flowers. Psyche lay down but could not sleep. Her heart still beat rapidly, while Apollo's prophecy echoed in her thoughts. Winged, terrible, serpent-like. At that moment, Psyche heard a sound within the darkness, a very soft footstep, then the quiet rustle of wings. Psyche held her breath. The prophecy was about to be fulfilled, yet there was something she did not know. The true master of that palace was not the monster she feared, but Eros, the god of love. And that night the most secret game of fate began. Surrounded by the silent splendor of golden columns and silver walls, time slowly lost its former meaning for Psyche inside that enchanted palace. Days passed like a dream. While sunlight filtered through the palace windows, the young princess wandered through the vast halls, moving slowly between solitude and magnificence. Yet each evening, when the sun drifted toward the horizon and the sky turned shades of orange and violet, the same emotions awakened in her heart, a fear she could not explain and a curiosity she could not resist. When night fell, the fate of the palace changed. The enormous corridors that remained silent throughout the day filled with an invisible anticipation. Psyche had come to understand that when darkness settled over the palace, her husband would arrive. And indeed, when night finally covered the silver walls and surrendered every corner of the palace to darkness, a faint movement stirred within the room. A presence had approached quietly. Psyche's heart began to beat faster. She believed the dreadful creature from Apollo's prophecy had come. Yet seconds later, the gentle touch that brushed her shoulder scattered her fear. The touch was neither harsh nor savage. It was soft, almost like velvet. That night, Psyche heard her husband's voice for the first time. The voice flowed through the darkness like a warm breeze. It carried no threat and no terror. Instead, it held a calm and reassuring strength. Slowly, Psyche's fearful expectations faded, because nothing about this mysterious presence resembled the monster described in Apollo's prophecy. The unseen figure approached her with tenderness, and warmth filled his voice. Yet something still troubled Psyche. Why did this man hide himself in darkness? At that moment, Eros, the god of love, gave Psyche a single rule that would shape their lives. The rule was simple but absolute. Psyche must never try to see his face. If she obeyed this command, The life they shared would continue forever. But if one day she surrendered to curiosity and tried to look upon him, their paradise would vanish in an instant. Psyche felt surprised when she heard those words, yet the confidence within her husband's voice was strong enough to quiet her fears. She accepted the rule and allowed herself to trust the mysterious man who came to her only in the darkness of night. After that first night, Psyche's life settled into a strange and gentle rhythm. During the day, she wandered through the palace gardens, ate the meals prepared by unseen servants, and spent her hours alone in halls filled with music. But when night arrived, everything changed. Her husband came quietly and remained beside her in the darkness. Gradually, Psyche began to feel safe within this unusual life. She could not see her husband, yet she felt his presence through touch. His hands were strong but gentle. The warmth of his skin felt real, and the softness of his hair slipped through Psyche's fingers. The young princess came to know her husband only through touch. Sometimes she traced the shape of his face with her hands. Sometimes she felt the strength of his shoulders, and sometimes she listened to the quiet rhythm of his breath against her skin. At first it seemed strange to form such a bond without sight, but over time, Psyche found herself falling deeply in love with the unseen presence who shared her nights. As days followed nights, Psyche gradually forgot the outside world. Her kingdom, her family, and the life she had once known lost their importance. The days inside the palace flowed like a peaceful dream, and each night the presence of her husband filled her entire world. Eros treated her not only as a wife, but almost as a spirit that guarded and protected her. Each night in his arms, Psyche felt like the most precious being in the world. Yet, in a quiet corner of her mind, a question remained unsolved. Who was this man? Why did he hide himself? Even though Psyche tried to silence these thoughts, human curiosity rarely stayed quiet for long. Sometimes, as she listened to her husband's voice, she imagined what his face might look like. At times, she pictured him as a radiant god shining like the sun. At other moments, she wondered whether he could somehow be the same dreadful creature mentioned in the prophecy. These thoughts were still faint, but the first sparks of doubt had already begun to form. One night, Eros whispered a secret that would change their lives. As Psyche rested in her husband's arms, his voice leaned close to her ear and told her that a new life had begun to grow within her. At first, Psyche could not understand what she had heard, but when Eros repeated his words, joy filled her heart. A child, their child. Even the silent walls of the palace seemed more alive with that news. Yet along with this blessing came another warning. Eros spoke with unusual seriousness. If Psyche protected their secret and never tried to discover his identity, the child she carried would be born a god. But if curiosity led her to break the rule, the child would be born mortal. When Psyche heard these words, she held her husband's hand tightly and promised that she would guard the secret forever. Even so, deep within himself, Eros still felt a quiet worry. The news of her pregnancy eased Psyche's loneliness. Passing her days alone no longer felt as difficult as before. As she walked through the palace gardens, she gently touched her stomach and imagined the child who would soon be born. While she ate the meals prepared by invisible servants, she felt the quiet peace of a mother. Yet a small knot of uncertainty still lived inside her heart. It was natural for a mother to wish to see the father of her child. Psyche tried to push this thought away, but it continued to grow within her mind. Each night Eros left the palace before dawn. As he departed, he placed a kiss upon Psyche's forehead and whispered the same warning every time. "Protect our secret, Psyche, or this light will burn us both." Psyche nodded each time she heard those words and swore again that she would remain faithful to him. From the outside, Psyche's life in the palace appeared perfect. Invisible servants fulfilled her wishes, the gardens overflowed with flowers, and music echoed through the halls at every hour of the day. Yet even the most perfect lives eventually form small cracks. The curiosity growing inside Psyche was one of those cracks. At first, the rule not to see her husband's face seemed like a small sacrifice, but each night, the faint sound of wings stirred her curiosity a little more. Psyche began to suspect that her husband might be a god, because his touch carried a strength beyond that of ordinary men. Yet at the same time, Apollo's prophecy still echoed within her mind. These two thoughts, one filled with wonder, the other with fear, slowly grew stronger inside her. During this time, Psyche's happiness reached its highest point. She was no longer a lonely princess. She was a wife, and soon she would become a mother. As she walked among the palace's golden columns, she often touched her stomach and imagined the cradle that invisible servants might prepare for her child. But the fate of ancient stories rarely allowed perfect happiness to last forever. Fate always had a strange affection for curiosity. Psyche did not yet realize it, but the small question growing within her heart would soon change everything. While Eros slept beside her each night, Psyche sometimes opened her eyes in the darkness and tried to imagine the face of the man who lay next to her. The desire to see him slowly became something stronger than curiosity. It began to turn into a longing that was difficult to resist. Thus, the calmest period of Psyche's life quietly unfolded. The palace remained silent, and the nights filled with the whispers of love. As the young princess fell asleep with her head resting on her husband's shoulder, she believed that every danger in the world lay far away. Yet events on Olympus moved in a very different direction. Aphrodite had not yet discovered her son's mistake. If she ever learned the truth, her anger would be powerful enough to shake the world. For now, only two lovers breathed within the palace, while the quiet heartbeat of the new life growing inside Psyche echoed in silence. But fate had already begun to move, and soon that peaceful happiness would reveal itself as the calm before a great storm. This story takes place in ancient Greece, and the characters are dressed in clothing appropriate for ancient Greek attire. In that enchanted palace where invisible servants fulfilled her every wish, Psyche's days passed almost like a dream. Each morning, the rising sun over the valley illuminated the golden columns, and the scent of flowers blooming in the palace gardens filled the air. Invisible servants appeared silently, fulfilling Psyche's needs even before she voiced them. Yet this perfect order could not fill the quiet emptiness in the young princess's heart. No matter how much splendor surrounded the human heart, the bonds of the past could not easily be forgotten. Psyche, especially with the sensitivity brought on by her pregnancy, began remembering her family and childhood more often. The voices of her sisters, the laughter they once shared while running together through the palace gardens, and the memories of those carefree days returned again and again to her mind. Over time, that longing grew almost unbearable. When her husband came to her at night, Psyche no longer whispered only words of love. Her eyes filled with tears as she confessed how deeply she wished to see her sisters once more. Eros refused this request firmly at first. He knew Psyche's sisters far too well. He sensed how dangerous the jealousy growing in their hearts could become. If the secret of this hidden valley and the palace concealed within it were ever broken, everything could be lost. As he listened to Psyche's pleas, a deep unease stirred within him. Yet it was not easy to remain unmoved in the face of her tears. Psyche held her husband's hands and insisted she only wished to see her family once, promising she would return to the palace afterward. In the end, Eros could not bear the sorrow of the woman he loved any longer. With great reluctance, he allowed Zephyros to bring her sisters to the valley. Before doing so, however, he warned Psyche one last time. "Do not tell them the secret of our palace, and no matter what happens, do not say that you have tried to see my face." Psyche nodded and gave her word. At that moment, she believed it would be nothing more than a simple visit. The next day, Zephyros swept over the jagged cliffs and found Psyche's sisters. The women stood near the edge of the cliff, mourning and believing their sister had died. Suddenly, the rising wind lifted them gently from the ground and carried them toward the valley filled with flowers. When they touched the earth again, the sight before them left them frozen with amazement. The palace rising before their eyes gleamed with columns of gold and silver light. Psyche welcomed them with great joy. She embraced her sisters, took their hands, and led them into the palace. Invisible servants appeared at once. Tables of feast were prepared. Fruits, wine, and honeyed breads were served on golden plates. Yet this magnificent welcome did nothing to change what lived inside the sisters' hearts. Instead, it awakened something darker within them. When they compared their own lives to the wealth Psyche now possessed, everything they had seemed dull and insignificant. As they gazed at the splendor of the palace, the sisters did not struggle to recognize the feeling growing inside them. It was envy. Psyche had once been their younger sister, the one who followed behind them. Seeing her now surrounded by such happiness was a truth they found difficult to accept, especially when they learned she had never seen her husband's face. Psyche spoke of him with innocent trust. "He comes at night," she explained. "His voice is gentle, and he treats me with great love." The sisters exchanged secret glances. They recognized an opportunity when they heard one. They remembered Apollo's prophecy very well. Psyche had been destined to marry a terrible creature. Carefully, they began choosing words meant to shake Psyche's confidence. At first, they showed false concern. Then fear slowly appeared in their expressions. "Psyche," they said, "we do not wish to hurt you, but we must tell you the truth. Your husband may not be human." Those words placed the first spark of doubt inside Psyche's heart. Until that moment, she had trusted her husband completely because he had always treated her with tenderness. But as her sisters continued speaking, Psyche's thoughts grew troubled. They reminded her of Apollo's prophecy, a winged creature feared even by the gods with a serpent-like body. They described a monstrous being who fattened Psyche only so he could devour both her and the child she carried. Their voices grew dramatic as they spoke. False tears ran down their faces, and their voices trembled with feigned fear. At first, Psyche resisted their accusations. She remembered the warmth of her husband's voice and the gentleness of his touch. Such kindness seemed impossible for a monster. Yet once the human mind encountered doubt, peace rarely returned easily. The sisters' words continued echoing in Psyche's thoughts long after they were spoken. When the sisters noticed the crack forming inside Psyche's certainty, they pushed their plan even further. They offered her a solution. If she truly wished to learn whether her husband was a monster, there was a way to discover the truth. That night, when he fell asleep, Psyche should light an oil lamp. By its glow, she would finally see his real face. If he truly proved to be a monster, she could kill him with a knife. As they described the plan, they deliberately reminded Psyche of the child growing inside her. If you do not kill him, they warned, he will tear you and your unborn child apart. These words planted the deepest form of fear inside Psyche's heart. Now the danger was not only her own life, but also the life of the child she carried. When the sisters finished their work, a secret satisfaction lingered on their faces. When Zephyros carried them back toward the cliff, they left behind a poisonous seed of doubt. After her sisters departed, Psyche wandered through the palace halls for a long time. The golden corridors that once brought her peace now felt strangely unfamiliar. She remembered her husband's warning, "Do not try to see me." Yet the terrible stories her sisters had told would not leave her mind. When night finally fell, Psyche was no longer the same woman she had been before. The innocent wife who trusted completely had vanished. In her place remained a woman filled with uncertainty. That night she placed a small oil lamp and a sharp knife beside the bed. When Eros entered the chamber as he always did, Psyche remained silent. Her heart beat wildly with fear and guilt. When her husband finally fell asleep, Psyche slowly rose from the side of the bed. Her hands trembled. Her sisters' voices echoed inside her mind. "Strike him, or you will die." The young princess picked up the lamp and slowly lit the wick. A small flame flickered and began to illuminate the dark chamber. Psyche leaned toward the bed. In a moment, the lamp's light would fall upon her husband's face. This moment would not only reveal the truth, it would also change Psyche's destiny. The first light of suspicion cast upon love often marked the beginning of something from which there was no return. Psyche did not know that yet. She only wanted to learn the truth. Yet the light in her hand was about to illuminate not only the darkness, but also the fragile turning point of a love story. And when Psyche brought the lamp a little closer, the door of fate slowly began to open. In the deepest hours of the night, while the silver walls of the palace reflected the pale glow of the moon outside, a heavy silence filled the chamber. This silence felt very different from the calm of an ordinary night. It carried the weight of a disaster drawing near. As Psyche slowly moved toward the edge of the bed, she felt the pounding of her heart inside her chest. Her sister's poisonous words still echoed in her mind. "He is a monster. He will destroy you and your child." In one hand she held a sharp knife, and in the other she carried the small oil lamp her husband had strictly forbidden her to use. Psyche, once the purest and most innocent princess of the kingdom, now stood trapped between fear and curiosity, on the brink of an act that would decide her fate. In the dark room, the breathing of her sleeping husband sounded steady and calm. That peaceful rhythm clashed with the doubt inside her. When the young woman lit the wick of the lamp with trembling fingers, the small flame slowly began to push back the darkness. The first light of the lamp cut through the darkness like a thin line and fell across the bed. Holding her breath, Psyche moved the lamp a little closer. The sight that appeared before her eyes bore no resemblance to the terrible monster her sisters had described. The figure lying on the bed possessed a beauty beyond anything in the world. Golden curls shone softly in the moonlight, and an almost divine peace rested upon his face. White wings flowing from his shoulders shimmered like silver under the light. In that moment, Psyche understood the truth. Her husband was not a monster, but Eros himself, the god of love. At the sight before her, her heart filled with both wonder and shame. The knife slipped from her hand and fell to the floor. In that moment, she realized that the thing she had truly feared had been her own curiosity. Before that divine beauty, her knees trembled. Even the beauty for which she had once been worshipped like a goddess seemed pale beside this radiant being. Psyche continued to stare at Eros's face as if under a spell. She moved the lamp closer and studied the delicate feathers of his wings, the smoothness of his skin, and the faint smile resting on his lips. At that moment, two emotions clashed inside her heart, a deep love and an unbearable guilt. Eros had trusted her. He had hidden his identity to protect her. Yet Psyche had broken that trust. As these thoughts crossed her mind, her trembling hands tilted the lamp slightly. That small mistake changed the direction of fate. A drop of burning oil slid from the lamp and fell onto Eros's shoulder. The hot oil touching the god's flawless skin woke him instantly. When Eros opened his eyes, he saw Psyche standing before him holding the lamp. For several seconds, neither of them moved. They simply looked at each other. In that moment, the silence in the room seemed to carry the weight of the entire world. The expression in Eros's eyes shattered Psyche's heart. There was no anger in his gaze. What appeared instead was a deep and painful disappointment. The god slowly rose from the bed. When he spread his wings, a gentle wind moved through the room. Psyche collapsed to her knees in tears. "Forgive me," she whispered. But Eros's voice sounded different now. It carried a heavy sorrow. "I defied my mother to protect you," he said. "I saved you from a fate where they believed you would belong to a monster. But you did not trust me." Those words pierced Psyche's heart like a blade. As Eros lifted himself into the air, he spoke his final words. "Love cannot live where there is no trust." His words echoed through the chamber as he drifted out through the window and flew into the dark night sky. Psyche cried out and ran to the window. Her fingers gripped the stone frame tightly. The beating of Eros's wings grew smaller and smaller as he disappeared into the darkness above. Psyche tried to throw herself after him, but it was already too late. The magic of the palace began to break the moment Eros left. The glow of the golden columns faded. The flowers in the gardens grew dim, as if they had awakened from a dream. The whispers of the invisible servants fell silent. The valley that had once looked like paradise now felt empty and lonely. Psyche collapsed onto her knees. Because of her curiosity, she had lost everything she possessed. The face she had longed to see now seemed forever beyond her reach. The young woman lifted her head toward the sky and cried out Eros's name, but the night gave her no answer. As Eros flew toward Olympus, he carried a heavy pain in his heart. The burn upon his shoulder was a small wound, but Psyche's broken trust hurt him far more deeply. Even for a god, the pain of betrayal was not easy to bear. While flying toward his mother's palace, Eros thought about the choices he had made. He had fallen in love with a mortal. To protect her, he had broken every rule, yet in the end, he had still been defeated by a mortal's curiosity. Meanwhile, Psyche remained alone in the valley. The palace that had once resembled heaven had vanished. Nothing remained except the cold wind of the night and the weight of her own mistake. Psyche sank to the ground in tears. Holding her stomach, she took a deep breath. She had not only lost her husband, she had also placed the fate of her unborn child in danger. She remembered the words Eros had spoken. If she had kept the secret, their child would have been a god. Now everything was uncertain. Psyche raised her head and looked into the dark sky. In that moment, a new decision formed inside her. This story would not end here. She would find Eros again. She would do whatever it took to earn his forgiveness. The princess who had once lived in a palace would now become a traveler, because true love sometimes had to be lost before it could be won again. Psyche rose to her feet and began to walk into the darkness. A long and painful road waited before her, but there was no turning back now. When Eros's shining wings disappeared into the endless depth of the night sky, the indescribable sorrow that settled in Psyche's heart did not only shake her soul, it seemed to shake the entire world around her. The magnificent palace that had stood proudly, with its golden columns and silver walls, sustained by the presence of the god of love, began to dissolve like an illusion as its master's disappointment lingered in the air. Within seconds, the grand halls, the lavish tables filled with food, and the gentle invisible servants vanished. In their place remained nothing but an empty wilderness where harsh winds swept across bare ground. Psyche felt as though she had been torn away from the divine peace in which she had slept only moments before. Suddenly she found herself standing in the middle of a lonely field filled with wild weeds and thorns. The unfortunate princess who had just been welcomed in a heavenly palace now stood covered in dust and earth, left alone with the cold weight of loneliness and the bitterness of her own betrayal. The valley was no longer the secret garden of a god. It had turned into a barren land that mirrored the storm raging inside Psyche's soul. The wind blew fiercely, scattering the dry grass, while one sentence echoed endlessly in her ears. Love cannot live where there is no trust. With every gust of wind, she seemed to hear Eros's words again, cutting into her heart like a blade. The shock she had endured, combined with the vulnerability of her pregnancy, clouded Psyche's thoughts. Once her beauty had emptied temples, drawing worship away from the gods themselves, yet now that same extraordinary body seemed broken beneath the weight of grief. Unable to bear the torment of her conscience, she threw herself into a nearby river that rushed wildly through the valley. But nature and the gods did not allow it. Out of respect for the memory of Eros and for the sacred life growing within her, the river god gently caught the young woman and carried her safely to the shore, laying her upon the soft reeds beside the water. As Psyche lay exhausted by the riverbank, Pan, the god of nature and shepherds, approached. With his goat-like legs and wise yet wild gaze, Pan immediately noticed the longing for death written on the young woman's face. When he listened to Psyche's sorrowful story, he did not answer her with harsh judgment, but with calm wisdom. He told her that death was not a solution, and that true love could only be regained through loyalty and effort. "Stop weeping, little mortal," Pan said gently. "The path to winning back the god of love does not lie in death, but in proving your regret through your actions. Seek him, soften his heart with your devotion and your prayers." Pan's words reignited the faint spark of hope that had almost died within Psyche. For the first time, she felt that she must face her fate instead of trying to escape it. Yet her heart held more than regret. After the destruction she had endured, a cold determination also began to grow inside her. She knew that the true cause of this disaster had been her jealous sisters. Without their poisonous whispers, she would never have lifted the lamp or broken Eros's trust. With that thought burning in her mind, Psyche first traveled to the kingdom of her eldest sister. There she told a tragic lie. She claimed that Eros had abandoned her, but had chosen her sister as his new bride. "Eros cast me away," she said with carefully feigned sorrow. "But the west wind, Zephyros, waits for you upon the cliffs. He will carry you to that palace and make you his new queen." Blinded by jealousy, the elder sister believed the story immediately. The thought of becoming the wife of a god and ruling within that magnificent palace consumed her mind completely. Without hesitation, she rushed to the cursed cliff and threw herself into the abyss, believing that Zephyros would catch her in his gentle wind. But this time no merciful breeze waited below, only the merciless hardness of the rocks. Psyche used the same plan with her other sister, and both women ultimately died upon those cliffs, victims of their own ambition and envy. After witnessing the tragic fate of her sisters, Psyche felt that justice had been fulfilled. From that moment forward, she focused only on finding Eros. Yet, reaching a wounded god was nearly impossible for a mortal. Psyche began to wander from city to city, searching temples for any trace of him. She was no longer the sheltered princess who had once lived in palaces. Her feet became wounded, her hair fell into disarray, and she turned into nothing more than a traveler seeking forgiveness. Once people had worshipped her beauty, but now Psyche walked the world like a humble soul, begging for the mercy of a god. Meanwhile, an entirely different storm erupted on Mount Olympus. When Aphrodite learned that her son Eros had returned wounded, she rose in furious anger. His disobedience had already angered the goddess. He had fallen in love with Psyche instead of punishing her as commanded. Yet what truly drove Aphrodite into a rage was the unbearable insult that a mere mortal woman had caused such chaos and had even wounded the god of love. Her fury doubled. She felt a deep wrath toward both her disobedient son and the mortal girl responsible for the disaster. Without delay, the goddess ordered that Psyche be found. Psyche, however, continued her journey unaware of the storm gathering against her. Pan's words echoed in her ears like a guiding compass. With every step she felt both the absence of Eros and the heavy burden of her mistake. There was no turning back. If she wished to find the love she had lost, she had to keep walking. This journey was not merely a search, it was also a transformation. Once her beauty had been admired like a statue, but now her face carried the marks of pain and determination. She had accepted that she must pay the price for her own mistake. With the deaths of her sisters, The debts of the past had been settled. Now only one path remained before her. She had to face the wrath of Aphrodite herself. As night fell, Psyche sat beside a small fire. She gently touched her stomach and made a silent promise to the child she carried. She would find its father. She would reclaim the love she had lost. No matter how long or painful the road ahead might become, she would never stop walking it. Having returned from the edge of death through Pan's wisdom and the river god's compassion, and having freed herself from the dark chains of the past by taking revenge on her sisters, Psyche now moved toward the heaviest trial of her soul. As she walked along dusty and uneven roads, her feet became stained with blood and her hair was scattered wildly in the wind. The divine face that once emptied temples because of its beauty now appeared pale beneath the shadow of sorrow and exhaustion. Yet the young woman still lived for a single purpose: to find Eros again and beg forgiveness for the betrayal she had committed against him. Reaching a wounded god, especially one who had taken refuge in the palace of his mother Aphrodite, stood far beyond the strength of any mortal. For that reason, Psyche set out hoping to seek the mercy of the other powerful goddesses of Olympus, believing that under their protection she might escape Aphrodite's wrath. Her first stop became the magnificent temple of the goddess Ceres, known among the Greeks as Demeter, the great guardian of harvest and fertility. When Psyche entered, she found the temple in disorder and neglect. Sickles lay abandoned on the ground, and bundles of harvested grain had been scattered carelessly across the floor. Driven by her sense of order and devotion, Psyche began to work despite her exhaustion. She cleaned the temple, gathered the sacred tools, arranged the altars again, and restored everything in a way worthy of the goddess's honor. Moved by this careful devotion, Ceres appeared wearing a crown woven from golden wheat and carrying the warm scent of fresh bread around her. Psyche fell at her feet in tears, told her the story of everything that had happened, and begged for protection from Aphrodite's anger. Yet the gentle expression on Ceres's face slowly changed when Aphrodite's name was spoken. The goddess of harvest felt gratitude for Psyche's devotion to the temple, but she also understood the delicate balance of Olympus. Aphrodite was not only the goddess of beauty, she was also a goddess whose honor had been wounded, and such matters were never treated lightly among the gods. Ceres sighed deeply. "I would gladly help you, little mortal," she said with sorrow in her voice. "But Aphrodite is both an ancient friend of mine and a powerful goddess. It would not be right for me to oppose the anger she believes is justified." Even though she did not see Psyche as an enemy but as a helpless friend, she gently advised the young woman to leave the temple. Despite the pain of rejection, Psyche did not give up. Her next destination became the temple of Juno, known among the Greeks as Hera, the queen of the heavens and protector of marriage. As Psyche passed through the marble gates, she carried within her heart the sacred burden of her pregnancy and the desperate hope of saving the marriage she had lost. Within that magnificent place watched over by peacocks, Juno finally appeared before the young woman. Psyche spoke of the divine child she carried within her, and of her unwavering love for Eros, and she asked the goddess for refuge. Juno saw the suffering Psyche had endured, and felt genuine compassion for her. The struggle of a wife trying to regain the loyalty of her husband moved the goddess deeply. Yet Juno, like Ceres, understood the balance of Olympus. She realized that Aphrodite had turned the matter into something greater than a family dispute. It had become a question of divine honor. The goddess looked at Psyche with a grave expression. "My devotion to law and order does not allow me to protect someone another goddess has declared a fugitive," she said. Aphrodite had already proclaimed Psyche not merely as the bride of her son, but as a criminal who had defied her authority and as a runaway slave. Because of this declaration, Juno also had no choice but to turn the young woman away. Even two of the greatest goddesses of Olympus did not dare risk divine harmony for the sake of a mortal woman's love. When both great gates closed against her, Psyche realized she no longer had any place left in the world where she could seek refuge. Her own mistake had torn her away from the world of humans, while the fear of the gods had left her completely alone. Yet, within that loneliness, a strange courage began to grow inside her. She realized that fleeing only prolonged her suffering. Hiding from Aphrodite's anger was impossible. Only one path remained. She had to face the goddess herself. Psyche lifted her head and made her decision. "If I am to win back my love," she thought, "the path is not escape, but the courage to face my fate." And so she decided to go directly to the palace of Aphrodite and surrender herself. While all this happened, Aphrodite no longer bothered to hide her anger and summoned Hermes, the messenger of the gods. She ordered that a proclamation be made across the world, announcing that Psyche must be found. Hermes climbed into his golden chariot and descended swiftly from the clouds to the earth. In marketplaces, temple squares, and at the great gates of kingdoms, he stopped and read the same announcement again and again in a loud voice. "Hear this, people," he proclaimed. "Whoever finds or reveals the location of Psyche, the youngest daughter of the king and a runaway slave, will receive from the goddess Aphrodite 7 sweet kisses and a reward sweeter than honey." Hermes's proclamation spread quickly from cities to villages, from harbors to royal courts. Psyche had now become not only someone fleeing from Aphrodite's wrath, but also prey pursued by the greed of those tempted by the reward. When Psyche finally reached Aphrodite's palace, her knees nearly gave way beneath her. The magnificent palace rising above the sea made her heart beat with fear. She knew that what waited for her inside would bring not only punishment, but humiliation as well. Still, whenever she remembered Eros's face, she found strength in her heart. When she reached the palace gates, the guards recognized her and immediately seized her, bringing her before the goddess. Aphrodite sat upon her throne. With flawless beauty and terrifying majesty, she looked down at Psyche and burst into a sharp laugh. "At last," she said in a mocking voice, "my lost bride has come to my door. So you finally understood that Ceres and Juno could not protect you." Psyche lowered her head and fell at the goddess's feet, holding her hands over her belly as if protecting the child within her. For Psyche, this moment did not mark an end, but the beginning of a new trial. Aphrodite saw her surrender as weakness and decided to give the young woman a series of impossible tasks. Grabbing Psyche by the hair, the goddess dragged her deeper into the palace. Psyche was no longer a princess. She had become a refugee willing to endure any suffering for the sake of love. The dazzling yet merciless palace of Aphrodite, born from the foam of the sea, had ceased to be a refuge for Psyche and had become a place where her soul would be forged through the heaviest trials. When the goddess of beauty saw the submission of this mortal princess who had once enchanted the world with her beauty, the fire of revenge inside her burned even more fiercely. Grabbing Psyche's silken hair in anger, she dragged her across the cold marble floors of the palace. There was no divine grace upon her face, only the hardness of wounded pride. Once honored before the people like a goddess, Psyche now lay humiliated beneath Aphrodite's feet like a slave. The scene echoing between the palace's towering columns was not only a punishment, but also a declaration of Aphrodite's injured honor. Psyche lowered her head and accepted the humiliation in silence, for she knew that the suffering she faced was the result of the broken trust and the mistake she had made. The only thing that kept her standing was the hope that still lived in her heart, the hope that one day she would be reunited with Eros. Whenever Aphrodite wished to avoid staining her own hands, she summoned two dark and somber servants. Their names were Anxiety and Sorrow, merciless beings whose faces held no trace of compassion. At the goddess's command, they threw themselves upon Psyche, tormenting her with lashes and cruel words. With every blow, Psyche instinctively tried to protect her stomach, shrinking into herself with the fragile awareness of the life she carried within her. The name of Eros slipped from her lips again and again without her meaning to speak it. Aphrodite watched the scene with cold satisfaction. At last, she looked at the young girl's bruised skin and tangled hair and spoke with a mocking smile. To her, Psyche was no longer the princess once praised for her beauty, but nothing more than a worthless servant. "A servant as ugly as you," she said in a voice dripping with contempt, "can only earn my favor through hard labor and by accomplishing the impossible." Her words were not merely an insult. They were the announcement of the trials that had just begun for Psyche. The goddess then led her to the vast storage halls of the palace, where an enormous pile of grain rose nearly to the ceiling. The towering heap consisted of wheat, barley, millet, lentils, peas, poppy seeds, and beans, all hopelessly mixed together. The grains were tangled so tightly that separating them seemed like a task beyond any human patience or strength. With a cold expression, Aphrodite turned to Psyche and gave her command. From sunset until dawn, every grain had to be separated according to its kind and arranged into perfect piles. If the task was not completed by sunrise, a fate worse than death awaited her. After speaking these words, Aphrodite closed the door of the granary and left the young woman alone in the darkness. Inside there remained nothing but the dry smell of grain and a suffocating silence. When Psyche looked at the enormous chaos before her, she immediately understood that no human effort could complete such work. Separating a single grain of wheat from hundreds of tiny poppy seeds might take hours, yet before her stood a mountain of mixed harvest. The task resembled not a trial, but a sentence of execution. Slowly, Psyche sank to the floor, no longer possessing the strength to cry or beg. She simply waited for her fate. Her thoughts drifted back to the night when she had seen Eros's face in the light of the lamp. Perhaps everything she suffered now was the inevitable price for breaking his trust. Yet deep within her heart, a small spark of hope still refused to die. At that very moment, the smallest creatures of nature noticed Psyche's silent despair. The ants, tireless dwellers of the earth, sensed the sorrow of the young girl and the innocence of the divine life she carried within her. The leader of the ant kingdom called out to his tiny army, and declared that the wife of the god of love must be helped. At once, countless ants poured into the granary from cracks in the walls, from tiny holes in the ground, and from beneath the door. With their small bodies, they scattered across the pile of grain. Each one grasped a single seed and carried it to the pile where it belonged. Psyche watched this miraculous labor in disbelief. Patiently and with perfect discipline, the ants transformed the enormous chaos created by Aphrodite into order. As the night deepened, the mound of grain slowly began to take shape. The wheat gathered into a shining golden heap. The barley formed its own pile in another corner. The tiny poppy seeds collected like a fine layer of sand. By the time the stars began to fade from the sky, the army of ants had finished its work. At dawn, 7 perfect piles of grain stood arranged in flawless order in the center of the granary. Their task completed, the ants quietly disappeared back into the darkness just as they had come. For the first time that night, Psyche felt genuine hope rise within her heart. Even the smallest creatures in the world had not remained indifferent to her despair. When the first rays of the sun entered through the small windows of the granary, Aphrodite threw the door open harshly. She had come expecting to witness Psyche's failure. Instead, she froze with anger at the sight before her. Psyche stood exhausted but upright, and behind her the grains were separated into perfect piles. Aphrodite refused to accept what she saw. "This was not your work," she shouted. "My wounded son helped you." The goddess dismissed the accomplishment and threw Psyche nothing more than a piece of dry bread. It was not a reward, but another insult. Yet with each failed plan, Aphrodite's anger grew, while Psyche herself grew stronger through every trial. The help of the ants had done more than separate the grains. It had broken apart the despair within Psyche's heart. If even the smallest creatures of nature could help her, perhaps one day Eros might forgive her as well. But Aphrodite had no intention of surrendering. The next task would be far more dangerous. As Psyche slowly ate the dry bread she had been given, she did not yet know what trial awaited her next. Yet for the first time she felt something stronger than fear growing inside her: determination. Aphrodite's anger had grown even stronger after Psyche had completed the first impossible task by sorting the grains with the help of the ants. The goddess of beauty no longer wished merely to punish the young woman whom people had once admired with awe. She wanted Psyche to be destroyed by the merciless forces of nature itself. For that reason, the next morning she led Psyche outside the palace to the edge of a dangerous river that ran between steep and jagged cliffs. On the far side of the river, a dazzling sight shone under the sunlight. A flock of rams wandered across a wide meadow, yet these were no ordinary animals. Each one carried fleece that gleamed as if it had been woven from pure gold, catching the sunlight and casting a sharp brilliance in every direction. Beneath that beautiful image, however, a terrible danger waited. These rams were savage and fiercely aggressive. During the hottest hours of the day, their rage grew even stronger, and they became violent enough to tear apart any living creature that dared approach them. Aphrodite had brought Psyche there for exactly that reason. Turning toward her with a cold gaze, the goddess gave her command. Psyche would cross the river and bring back a handful of golden fleece from that wild herd. Although the task looked like a simple trial, it was truly a deadly trap. To approach those animals meant standing among sharp horns and iron-hard hooves. As Psyche stood at the riverbank and looked at the shining herd across the water, she understood the real purpose of the task. Aphrodite did not want her to fail, she wanted her to die. Dark thoughts passed briefly through the young woman's mind. Eros's words echoed once more in her ears. Love could not live where there was no trust. As she remembered those words, the weight of her regret grew heavier in her heart. For a moment she considered throwing herself into the river and ending the pain. At that very moment, however, a thin reed near the water rustled softly in the wind. The gentle whisper of the reed seemed to speak to Psyche. Like a small but wise voice from nature itself, the plant advised her not to hurry. It explained that the rams were at their most violent and dangerous, while the sun stood high in the sky. But when evening approached and the burning heat of the day began to fade, the animals would retreat into the shadows to rest. At that time, the golden strands of fleece caught among the thorny bushes could be gathered easily. Psyche listened carefully to this quiet advice. As the sun climbed slowly across the sky, she waited. When the hottest hours of the day passed, she truly saw the herd withdraw into the shade of the trees. Moving quietly, she crossed the river and began collecting the pieces of golden fleece tangled in the thorns of the bushes. In a short time, her arms were filled with fleece that shone like the sun itself. When Psyche returned to the palace, Aphrodite clenched her teeth in anger at the sight of her. When she saw the golden fleece in the young woman's hands, she felt certain that this could not have been accomplished by Psyche's own cleverness alone. Someone must have helped her. For the goddess, Psyche's success was unacceptable. Without losing any time, she prepared a third task that was even more terrible. This time the goal was the dark waters of the river Styx, whose name even the gods spoke with respect. Aphrodite handed Psyche a crystal vessel and sent her toward a towering cliff beyond the palace. From the summit of that cliff burst the black and freezing waters of the Styx as they poured down into the dark valleys of the underworld. The goddess ordered Psyche to reach that dreadful source, fill the crystal vessel with the river's water, and return with it without spilling a single drop. Yet reaching that place was almost impossible. The rocks were extremely steep, and at the place where the water emerged, terrible dragons stood guard. When Psyche reached the edge of the cliff, the sight before her was truly terrifying. The rocks were sharp and slippery, rising almost like a vertical wall. From the highest point, a dark and ominous water roared as it poured downward. This was the water of the river Styx, the sacred river by which the gods swore their oaths, a river bound to death and the world beneath the earth. As Psyche held the crystal vessel in her hands, she realized that this was not a place any human could reach. At that moment, a great shadow passed across the sky above her. It was the eagle of Jupiter, the eagle of Zeus himself. The king of the gods had seen the loyalty Psyche had shown in her struggle and had decided to help her. The enormous eagle glided down through the clouds and landed beside her. With its powerful talons, it took the crystal vessel and spread its vast wings as it rose toward the cliff. It flew swiftly above the terrible rocks where the dragons kept watch. Passing through poisonous vapors and the roaring darkness of the waters, the eagle carefully filled the vessel with the black water of the Styx. Then it returned with the same speed and placed the vessel back into Psyche's hands. When Psyche brought the vessel to Aphrodite, the goddess began to understand that more than luck stood behind this young woman. Even nature and the gods themselves seemed to stand with her. That realization only made her fury burn even stronger. The golden fleece and the water of the Styx were clear proof that Psyche would not surrender. Yet Aphrodite had no intention of retreating. Instead, she had already begun preparing the final plan that would destroy the young woman. Psyche still did not realize this. As she handed the dark water brought by the eagle to the goddess, she felt a strange calm within herself. Fear was no longer as powerful as it once had been. The help of the ants, the wisdom of the reed, and the aid of the eagle had shown her one clear truth. The universe itself had witnessed her struggle. The naive girl who had once believed her sister's lies was slowly changing into a woman who listened to the signs of the wind, the water, and the sky. Each trial strengthened Psyche a little more and deepened the maturity of her spirit. With every new task Aphrodite set before her, she unknowingly pushed Psyche closer to the realm of the gods. As the sun slowly moved toward the horizon, Psyche stood at the gates of the palace waiting for the next command. Her body was exhausted, and her pregnancy had begun to weigh heavily upon her. Yet the determination in her heart had never been stronger. Aphrodite continued to humiliate her, wounding her with words and implying that even the gods had taken her side. But Psyche was no longer shaken by those words. Deep inside, she felt that something had changed. The voice of Eros no longer echoed in her mind as a reproach, but as a distant source of strength. She still did not know that the final task waiting before her would tear her away from the world of the living and lead her into the realm of the dead. Aphrodite's patience had finally run out. Psyche's success in separating the grains with the help of the ants, gathering the golden fleece from among the wild rams, and bringing back the dark water of the Styx, had dealt a heavy blow to the goddess's pride. For Aphrodite, it was intolerable that a mortal, especially this young woman she had once humiliated and enslaved, had overcome divine trials one by one. As the goddess of beauty looked at Psyche, not only anger but also wounded arrogance burned in her eyes. She decided to choose a darker path to destroy her. Holding a small, plain-looking box in her hand, she appeared before Psyche. The goddess's voice sounded calm, yet threatening. She ordered Psyche to take the box to Persephone, the queen of the underworld, and ask her for a portion of divine beauty to place it inside the box and bring it back. At first glance, the task resembled a simple errand, but Psyche understood the truth immediately. This was not merely a journey, it was a descent into the realm of death. Mortals who entered Hades' dark kingdom while still alive rarely returned. Aphrodite had spoken those words knowing exactly what they meant. As Psyche held the box in her hands, she felt the weight in her heart grow heavier. Before her now stood a trial that seemed more impossible than any she had faced before. The thought crushed Psyche's spirit. After walking for a long time, she dragged her exhausted body toward a tall tower that rose upon a hill. The sky lay covered with gray clouds, and the wind howled through the cracks of the stones. Psyche lifted her head and looked at the top of the tower, and the despair inside her grew stronger. If she could not find a path leading down into the underworld, perhaps the only solution was to throw herself from the height. In that way, she believed she might reach the land of the dead more quickly. With heavy steps, she climbed the tower's stairs, and when she reached the highest point, she stood at the edge, staring into the empty space below. Just as she considered casting herself into the void, something unexpected happened. The stones of the tower began to tremble as if they were alive. A deep and ancient voice reached Psyche's ears. The voice came from the tower itself. The tower had understood the young girl's despair. It told her not to choose death, and began to explain how she could reach the underworld. Psyche needed to carry 2 coins and 2 barley cakes with her. The coins would be given to Charon, the ferryman who carried the dead across the river. The cakes would calm the terrifying 3-headed dog Cerberus. Yet the tower's most important warning concerned something else entirely. In the underworld, mercy was a dangerous trap. Along the road she would encounter shadows, pleading spirits, and old figures begging for help. Psyche must not stop for any of them. If she did, she would never return. Keeping the tower's words carefully in her mind, Psyche walked toward the cave that opened the path to the underworld. The moment she stepped inside its mouth, the sunlight disappeared behind her, and a heavy darkness replaced it. The air felt cold, and the stone walls were damp. With every step, the echo of her footsteps blended with whispers that seemed to belong to other spirits. Along the path, she truly encountered the strange scenes the tower had described. An old man pretended to fall and begged Psyche to help him. A woman showed the baby in her arms and pleaded for mercy. Another shadow approached her, claiming he could not carry his burden any longer. Though Psyche's heart ached, she kept walking. She remembered the tower's warning. At last she reached the misty banks of the river Styx. Its black waters flowed slowly and silently. An old boat rocked upon the surface of the river, and inside it sat the ferryman Charon, whose face looked like a shadow carved from darkness. When Psyche extended her first coin, Charon lifted his head and allowed her into the boat. The boat moved slowly toward the opposite shore. There, the giant 3-headed dog Cerberus stood before her. When Psyche threw the barley cake onto the ground, the beast immediately lunged toward it, and the path opened before her. At last, Psyche reached the palace of Persephone. The palace stood dark yet magnificent. Columns of black marble rose among the shadows, and pale torches cast trembling light along the walls. Persephone, the queen of the underworld, sat silently upon her throne. Psyche bowed with respect and explained Aphrodite's request. Persephone looked at the young woman's face for a long time. She understood how difficult this journey had been, and how faithfully Psyche had carried out her task. For that reason, she did not refuse the request. She placed the mysterious beauty Aphrodite desired inside the small box. Psyche took the box and began to return along the same path. She calmed Cerberus with the second cake, gave Charon the final coin, and eventually reached the world of the living once again. Yet the moment she stepped back into the sunlight, an old thought appeared in her mind. Inside the box rested Persephone's divine beauty. If she took even a small portion of it, perhaps Eros would find her more beautiful once again. That thought slowly began to gnaw at Psyche's mind. When Psyche finally emerged alive from the dark paths of the underworld and reached the light of the sun again, she felt real air filling her lungs for the first time in what seemed like ages. The misty atmosphere of the land of the dead, Charon's creaking boat, and the ominous growls of Cerberus all lay behind her now. She held tightly to the small box Persephone had given her, and within her heart she felt a tired but proud calm. knowing she had overcome each of Aphrodite's impossible tasks one by one. Psyche, who had once been a delicate princess raised in palace halls, had become someone entirely different. A traveler who had crossed thorny roads, passed through the gates of the underworld, and faced the shadow of death itself. Yet as the warmth of sunlight touched her skin again, a familiar thought slowly stirred in her mind. When she looked at the small box in her hands, an old weakness awakened deep within her heart. Inside that box rested Persephone's divine beauty. Aphrodite had sent Psyche into the underworld to retrieve it, but another idea had begun to grow quietly in her thoughts. If she took just a small portion of that beauty, perhaps the exhaustion on her face would disappear after all she had endured. Perhaps Eros might see her again and find her beautiful once more. That single thought awakened the same dangerous curiosity that had once shattered everything. The young woman stopped among the rocks and stared at the box for a long time. One part of her heart warned her not to open it, while another part tried to persuade her with the quiet but powerful voice of curiosity. Psyche feared returning to Aphrodite's palace with a pale and exhausted face, only to meet the goddess's mocking gaze. After everything she had suffered, perhaps this small touch of divine beauty might restore some life to her appearance. The thought seemed harmless at first, yet in the world of the gods, innocent curiosity often opened the door to disaster. With trembling fingers, Psyche slowly lifted the lid of the box. But no golden light shone from within, and no divine glow spread into the air. Instead, from inside the box, seeped the dark essence of the underworld itself, the Stygian sleep flowing outward like a heavy mist. This was not the gentle sleep of living people. It belonged to the realm of the dead, a deep and shadowy numbness that froze thought and movement alike. The moment the mist touched Psyche's face, her eyelids grew heavy. Her knees weakened beneath her, and the young woman slowly collapsed onto the grass. As Psyche lay motionless, the world around her sank into silence. The sun still shone in the sky, and the wind still moved through the grass with a faint whisper, but Psyche heard none of it anymore. The deathly sleep that had escaped from the box completely surrounded her body. Just as she had reached the edge of freedom, she had once again fallen victim to her own curiosity. Yet at that same moment, something very different unfolded in Aphrodite's palace. The wound Eros had suffered when the hot oil fell upon his shoulder had finally healed, and the god of love had regained his strength. While resting in the chamber where he had been kept, Eros had felt the suffering of the woman he loved. Deep within his heart, he had sensed her descent into the underworld, her passage through its dark paths, and her unwavering determination to complete the task given to her. That devotion had dissolved all the bitterness that had once remained inside him. Then a heavy scent carried by the wind reached the god's senses, the unmistakable presence of that deadly sleep. Eros understood immediately what had happened. Psyche had once again surrendered to her curiosity. Without a moment of hesitation, the god rose. Eros spread his powerful wings and launched himself through the barred window into the night sky. The magnificent wings that Psyche had once seen by the light of the lamp now cut through the heavens with unstoppable force. When the god descended swiftly to the earth like a falling star, he found Psyche's motionless body lying beside the road. She lay there like a statue carved from stone. Eros dropped to his knees and looked down at her face. In a single instant, every trial she had endured flashed through his mind: the help of the ants, the golden fleece, the water of the Styx, and the long dark roads of the underworld. Carefully, he gathered the heavy mist of sleep that still lingered in the air. With the tips of his fingers, he drew the dark cloud back together and sealed it once again inside the box before closing the lid. Then he took an arrow from his quiver. This arrow was not a weapon meant to kill, but a sacred touch that awakened love itself. When the tip of the arrow gently touched Psyche's skin, the young woman drew a deep breath. Her eyes slowly opened, and she saw Eros standing before her. Surprise and joy shone together in Psyche's eyes. Eros looked at her with a gaze that carried both gentle reproach and deep affection. "You nearly lost yourself again because of that curiosity," he said softly. Yet there was no anger in his voice anymore, only quiet compassion. When Psyche parted her lips to speak, Eros gently helped her to her feet. The god knew that this story could not continue in the same way any longer. He told Psyche to carry the box to his mother, Aphrodite, and complete the task she had been given. As for himself, he had already made a greater decision. The fate of their love could no longer remain in the hands of Aphrodite's anger alone. Eros spread his wings once more and rose toward the golden heights of Olympus. He would stand before Zeus, the father of the gods, and ask for the judgment that would change this story forever. Psyche, meanwhile, began walking toward Aphrodite's palace with the box still in her hands. Fear no longer held the same power over her, because during this long journey, her soul had changed. She had once been a young girl who lost the one she loved because of curiosity, but now she had become a woman who had entered the realm of death itself for the sake of love. When she looked up at the sky, she saw the distant shimmer of Eros's wings shining like a star. At that moment, Psyche understood she was not alone. Aphrodite's anger and the harsh laws of Olympus still stood before her, yet the direction of fate was about to change. The god of love was no longer hiding. He was preparing to defend the woman he loved before the assembly of the gods. And though Psyche did not yet know it, this journey would lead her not only to forgiveness, but to a destiny far beyond the fate of ordinary mortals. After the god of love Eros awakened Psyche from the sleep of death, he understood that this long and painful story had finally reached its end. All the suffering his beloved had endured, the journey through the dark paths of the underworld, the patience and devotion she had shown while facing Aphrodite's endless trials, could no longer remain only a hidden love story. For that reason, he spread his wings and rose toward the highest peaks of Olympus. When he stood before Zeus, the father of gods and men, the young god no longer behaved like a careless child. Bowing his head, Eros described one by one the pain Psyche had endured, the humiliations she had suffered, and the strength of a soul that had never abandoned its love. He no longer wished to keep their bond hidden. He asked only one thing of the gods, that Psyche's fate would not end like that of a sacrificed victim, and that their love would be recognized among the immortals. As Eros's voice echoed between the towering columns of Olympus, many of the gods watched in astonishment. For the first time they witnessed a mortal who had passed through such severe trials and still remained unbroken. Zeus remained silent for a long time. The ruler of the heavens considered both Eros's words and the long journey Psyche had endured. He remembered well the countless mischiefs of the god of love, and had not forgotten the times Eros's arrows had driven gods and mortals alike into unwanted passions. Yet this time the situation before him was different. This love had not been a passing desire. It had grown through trials, had been shaped by suffering, and had been strengthened by loyalty. At last, Zeus lifted his mighty head and announced his decision. Psyche had been tested enough. She had shown the greatest courage a mortal could show. Zeus summoned Aphrodite before him and declared that her anger must finally come to an end. At first, the goddess of beauty felt her pride wounded, yet Zeus's word on Olympus could not be challenged. Aphrodite drew a deep breath and slowly bowed her head. She had no choice but to accept the marriage. After making his decision, Zeus called Hermes. The swift messenger of the gods put on his golden sandals and descended immediately to the earth, carrying the decree that would change Psyche's destiny forever. At that moment, Psyche was walking toward the palace of Aphrodite. Hermes descended from the sky before her and delivered Zeus's command. Psyche felt a brief moment of astonishment, but Hermes gently lifted her into the air. Passing above the clouds, the young woman soon reached the radiant palaces of Olympus. Before her stood a sight she had never imagined. Golden columns rose toward the heavens, and the halls of the gods overflowed with light. As Psyche's heart beat with excitement, Zeus approached her and held out a golden cup. Inside the cup was ambrosia, the sacred drink that granted immortality to the gods. In a calm voice, Zeus spoke to her. "Drink this, Psyche. With this, you will leave mortality behind and live forever beside Eros." When Psyche raised the cup to her lips, she felt her fate changing. The moment ambrosia passed her lips, a great transformation began within her body. The traces of suffering, the exhaustion of her trials, and the weight of mortality vanished at once, as if they had never existed. From Psyche's shoulders, delicate and shining wings began to grow. They resembled the fragile wings of a butterfly, fitting for a name that meant both soul and butterfly. She was no longer merely a beautiful mortal woman. She had become one of the new goddesses of Olympus. When Eros saw his beloved in this transformed form, a deep happiness shone in his eyes. Once these two souls had been separated because trust had been broken, but now they were united among the immortals themselves. When Eros took Psyche's hand, he knew that nothing in the world could ever break the bond between them again. The story that had once begun in a dark chamber now reached its fulfillment within the brightest halls of the heavens. A great wedding feast was prepared on Olympus, and the gods gathered to celebrate their union. Apollo played his golden lyre while the muses sang songs of love's triumph. Dionysus filled the cups with wine, and Hera blessed the sacred bond of marriage as the halls of Olympus filled with music, laughter, and light. Even Aphrodite finally joined the celebration. At first, she approached her new daughter-in-law with a cold expression, but as the feast continued, she remembered the long journey Psyche had endured. This young woman had risen to Olympus not only through beauty, but through the strength of her soul. In the end, Aphrodite smiled and took Psyche's hand, formally welcoming her as part of her divine family. This wedding was not simply the union of two lovers. It was the declaration of harmony between love and the soul itself. Time passed, and from this sacred marriage, a daughter was born. The gods named her Hedone, the goddess of pleasure and joy. Her birth symbolized more than the arrival of a child. It represented the meaning of Psyche's long journey, for true happiness could only be born when the soul matured through love. Once Psyche had stood among humans as a lonely beauty, but now she lived on Olympus as a goddess beside her family. The story of Eros and Psyche began to spread among the gods themselves, told again and again as a tale of wonder and reverence. And so the young girl who had once been left alone at the edge of a cliff now lived forever among the clouds of Olympus as a goddess. At times, Psyche remembered the days of her past, the night when the ants had helped her, the valleys where she had gathered the golden fleece, and the dark paths of the underworld. All those trials had brought her to this moment. Now she lived in peace beside Eros beneath the golden light of the heavens. Even the gods spoke of this story with respect, for Psyche's journey revealed that the human soul could pass through the darkest trials and still rise through love to immortality. And high among the clouds of Olympus, the story of Eros and Psyche continued to be told forever. Once in the palaces of the kingdom of Miletus, the young girl Psyche was greeted as a second Venus. When her beauty drew the jealousy of a goddess upon her, she did not know that her fate would unfold into such a profound transformation. The long journey that carried her from the golden halls of the palace to the loneliness of the jagged cliffs, from there to the mysterious palace of an unseen husband, and finally to the dark gates of the underworld, was never truly the trial of a princess, but the trial of a soul. The ants that separated the grains, the valleys that guarded the golden fleece, the black waters of the Styx, and the silent palace of Persephone all became stages that tested Psyche's patience, curiosity, and faith. Each task seemed to have been prepared so that the soul could mature a little more, grow heavier with understanding, and eventually discover its own essence. And when she finally lifted the cup of ambrosia to her lips on Olympus, Psyche did not only leave her mortality behind, she proved how the human soul could pass through suffering and still reach the light. In that moment, she ceased to be merely the daughter of a king and became the living symbol of the winged soul of humanity. For Eros, this story was never simply an adventure of love. The playful god who once stirred human hearts with his arrows discovered the true meaning of his power through his love for Psyche. The broken trust, revealed in the light of the lamp, separated them. Yet Psyche's trials and Eros's decision to stand before Zeus in order to save the one he loved revealed that love was not merely passion, but responsibility as well. When Zeus approved their union, he did not only change the destiny of two lovers, but also altered the balance of the heavens themselves. Love and soul were no longer separate forces, but two faces of the same existence. When the passion of Eros joined with the patience of Psyche, a harmony appeared that even the gods could not resist. For this reason, the wedding celebrated on Olympus was more than a marriage. It became a restoration of the cosmic order. As the lights of that magnificent feast filled the sky, the gods celebrated their union. Zeus and Hera sat upon the highest throne. Apollo filled the heavens with melodies from the strings of his lyre, and Dionysus joyfully filled the cups with wine. The goddesses of the seasons decorated the halls with roses, while the muses sang songs praising the triumph of love. Aphrodite stood beside Psyche, the young goddess she had once seen as an enemy, and now looked at her daughter-in-law with pride. In the end, Even she understood that beauty alone could never rule. Beauty revealed its true value only when it united with a soul shaped by patience. Psyche's journey had proven exactly that. As time passed, the sacred union bore its fruit and a child was born, Hedone. The gods gave her this name because she symbolized not simple pleasure, but the deep happiness that came after suffering. All the trials Psyche endured, her frightening journey to the underworld, and the tasks she completed with patience ultimately led to the birth of this new life. As Hedone's laughter echoed through the halls of Olympus, the gods understood the true meaning of the story more clearly than ever. True happiness was never a reward gained easily, but a gift that arrived only after the soul matured through patience. For that reason, the story of Psyche and Eros became not merely a tale of love, but an epic of the transformation of the human soul. Through the centuries, philosophers and poets interpreted this myth in many different ways. Some saw Psyche's journey as the rise of the human soul from the material world toward the divine. Others viewed her curiosity as a symbol of humanity's desire to learn. Indeed, Psyche opening the box was not merely a mistake. It also reflected humanity's endless curiosity toward the unknown. Perhaps that was why the touch of Eros that awakened her symbolized love's power to forgive even the darkest mistakes. The story continued to live within art, poetry, and thought. The butterfly became a shining symbol carved upon tombs because Psyche's soul whispered that even death itself was only another transformation. Even today, those who listen to this legend could recognize traces of their own lives within Psyche's story. At some point, every person resembled Psyche standing with the lamp in her hands. People wondered, made mistakes, lost what they loved, and then began searching again. Psyche's journey reminded us of a simple truth. The soul could never reach true light without first passing through darkness. Without patience, there was no trust, and without trust, love could never endure. For that reason, the story of Eros and Psyche was never simply a myth from the distant past. It became the story of the endless dance between love and the soul within every human heart. In every heart lived a little of Psyche's curiosity and a little of Eros's fire. Perhaps that was why anyone who looked up at the night sky could almost hear the echo of their story among the distant stars. Once love and soul joined together, they left a mark that even time could never erase. And that mark whispered the same lesson to every generation. True happiness was never a reward easily found, but a journey discovered through patience, learned through mistakes, and completed through love. I hope that as you ended your day, this ancient epic had been a good story for you. I looked forward to your comments and your requests. Do not forget to follow my channel. May the darkness of the night and the rhythm of the sea bring you peace. Until we met again in another legend, in the breath of another hero, love.